In the last video, we put together a very simple application tabs component that has two tab bar iOS item and tab bar iOS item components inside of it, and a tab bar iOS wrapper around it. And this is all inside of an index.ios.js file so that we can render application tabs using the native components. Now there's a whole bunch of other arguments or other things we can pass through to these components. They're really quite powerful. But for now, we're just using the system icon and the icon size. So the next thing I want to do is I want to make these things actually function as real tab switching components. And in order to do that, we need to specify a state for the component and then an ability to set which tab we're presently on. So in this case, we're going to be working with a new kind of reducer. So I'm going to be working with a new reducer. I'm going to call this reducer a navigation reducer. And so I'm going to go to app reducers navigation. And I'm going to, before we jump into this, let's just quickly look at the other reducer that we have in our application. So we have two files in the reducers folder. We have recipes and we have index. Index, if we remember, is just a file that serves as a manifest for all the files or all the reducers in our application, and it combines them all together. So right now we're just importing star from recipes reducer. So we're probably going to want to import star from navigation reducer and add that to our set of reducers in the application. So let's take a look at the other reducer that we have in our application, which is the recipes reducer. And you can see that the two things that we're doing at the top is we're using this create reducer method, which I've already discussed, and the list of global constant action types. So let's grab these two things. Now it is worth mentioning that React Native's Navigation Experimental includes some additional tooling for handling state, and we're going to be using some of those tools in our actions, but we're still going to be creating our own reducer. And so in a way, the reducer that we create is closer to how we envision the global state of our application rather than how React Native is prescribing that we navigate from scene to scene. At the end of the day, they're basically the same. However, I've personally found that this part of the navigation experimental stuff is still very much in flux, and this approach seems to work for simple examples. So our reducer is going to be called the tabs reducer, and we will create it, and we're going to have to create it with a default state, which I'll define in just a moment. And I'm also going to define a list of all the tabs in my application. And it's going to actually be an array of functions, which will take in the last root, and it will either return the last root, or if there's nothing, it will do object.assign, and it will return, actually I don't even think we can just say key home, and then the index, which is the most important bit of data, is going to be 0. So either we return a function if you give me one, or we return a default for all tabs, which is going to be the new tab. So we have two tabs in our application. We have home and we have about. One is index of 0, the other is index of 1. In some cases, you might want to store additional data in your tabs reducer, such as maybe a title if you're dealing with modal windows, or a background color, or I don't know what. You can get pretty fancy here, but the index is probably the most important thing because that will help you determine which tab is active. Now, when I'm creating my tabs reducer, I'm going to define my default, and in my case, my default is going to be index 0, key, home, and then I'm going to define my default set of routes to be all tabs. And this is important because what the navigation experimental library is trying to do is it's going to be looking for certain routes, and then it will be calling these functions to essentially trigger the new state of the tabs reducer in our application. So that's that. The next thing we need to do is we need to specify which types we're listening to. Not a huge change here, but under actions, just like I've got a section for recipes, I'm also going to create a section for navigation. And I'm going to say I want to export default, and it's going to be set tab, which will equal set tab. Not too exciting, but it's good to have constants. It makes it easier not to make typos. And just like the other reducer that we wrote, it's going to be a function associated with a hash table, and we will return a new version of the state, which will be the state passed in, and then all tabs with the action.index. So we're keying off of the index that we're given. If we're given 0, then we're going to call this one. If we're given 1, we're going to call this one. So we're going to key off of that, and then we're just going to run that function. So this will, in fact, return the new state of our application, and it will merge in. So what we'll end up doing is actually replacing these two parts of the state, but keeping all the routes that are presently available in our application. And so in this way, we will be able to switch from one tab to another using our actions. Of course, talking about actions, we don't have any in our application yet, so we should probably fix that too. In the same way that we have a index.js file for reducers, we probably also have an index.js file for actions. So here I'm going to create a new navigation actions reference. I know that I'm using a lot of files, but I find that it's very consistent, and even if each file only has 5 or 6 lines of code, it's helpful to know that if something is labeled a certain thing over in one place of the application, it's going to probably exist in somewhere else of the application in a similar way. So we've got the navigation actions, which are going to be pretty straightforward. Actions navigation.js. Now again, for comparison, if we take a look at the actions for recipes, we can see that it's very simple. We just have a function for describing the shape of the action, and we have a function for fetching recipes that dispatches that action just down here. So that's pretty good. That's pretty straightforward. I like that. In fact, this could be further refined to just recipes, but that's a side. Okay, so what do we want to do here? What do we need? We definitely need our types. Those are good. We like those. And this is where we're actually going to use navigation experimental. So I'm going to import from React Native. And I'm going to grab navigation experimental. Equals React Native. And the part that I'm interested in is this wonderful function that they've created called jump to index, which is in navigation experimental.stateutils. So there's a function in the bowels of navigation experimental for switching between different states. There's different ways of doing that. You can push on a stack, you can jump from one index to another, you can pop off a stack, which is like going back, and there's a few other niceties. But the simplest one is just to jump from one index to another. And that also is why when we're doing our reducer here, under reducers, navigation, the set tab reducer is just basically replacing the current state, which is that base portion of the state of the tabs reducer. Again, a lot of this stuff is shifting, so I'm sure that there's probably better ways of doing things, but this seems to be working right now, and I definitely would love to learn more about it as you try your own implementations. So just as I have an action type of setTab, I'm going to create a function called setTab, and it will take in a tab index, and it will return with a dispatch and the state. And here we will grab the tabs from getState. So we're just plucking those out. And then we're going to dispatch a new object of type types.setTab. And I'm going to call jump to index with the tabs that I have. So the current version of my state for the tabs reducer, and then my new tab index, which is being passed in from the function up here. And there you have it. So we've now hooked everything up. The question is, does it do anything? We don't really know because we didn't test any of it, which we probably should have. But at least we've got our action, we've got our reducer, and now we just have to make the whole thing work together. So let's go back to our app tabs index.ios.js file. If you remember, when we refresh this page, we don't see a whole lot. We just see favorites and more, but we don't see anything particularly interesting. We need to, first of all, indicate somehow what is our current index. Now, if I refresh this page here, I actually have very little information at my disposal about what the state is. And so it would be helpful at least to see where we are in terms of our global state. So one of the things that I'm going to need is the state of the tabs reducer. So I'm going to say that tabs is going to be state.tabs. Refresh this. And I'm just going to drop a little console.log in here. See what this .props looks like. What are the props of my application right now? Okay, so we have tabs. And we know that our present tab is 0 and the key is home, and then we have 2 routes available to us, which are the 2 functions. And we have some other actions. We have setTab, we have setSearched recipes. So all of that stuff seems to be in place. The question now is just how do we ensure that the right tab is selected? So let's do that. You just have to say selected equals this.props.tabs.index. In this case, it's going to be 1. And in this case, it's going to be 0. Refresh this again. And now you'll notice that the home route is actually rendering correctly. Of course, clicking on this doesn't do anything, but we can fix that. Next step is that we actually have no actions. We have no events that are firing. So there's no way for us to change which route we are presently on. So I'm going to say that on press, I want to trigger a function which will return this.onPress with 1 or 0. And we'll define what that function is in just a moment. Yes, that makes sense. So basically, no matter what you press, it's going to call this onPress function. And the onPress function is going to have a tab index. And then with that tab index, we should be able to call this .props.setTab, which is the action that we've just defined. Refresh this again. Oh, and it looks like I missed a set of curly braces. Okay, and we're back. And when I click, I go from favorites to more to favorites to more, but the top is not changing. And we know that because we're actually just rendering the same scene in both cases. So I'm just going to change this to about. Of course, about doesn't exist. We have to change that. And for our purposes, just going to create a new component here. We don't really need any of this. Certainly don't need that. Certainly don't need that. I probably am going to end up using less of this than I envisioned. Refresh this again. My expected token should be about. And okay, there we go. So we have favorites, we have about. Let's just take a look at our debugger for a moment. And we can actually see that those actions are being fired as expected and our state is being changed. So we have the searched recipe state and we have the tab state. And that is all functioning as we had hoped. Very good. So hopefully this was helpful. I'm sure there's still much to discover with Navigation Experimental. I could also look into a quick demo on how you can do modal windows, but at least with the bottom tabs and Redux in place, you can start to navigate to different parts of the application. I'm John Lebensold, and thanks for listening.